哈喽，好，我是 Tim， 所以这期视频可能会和以往的稍微有那么一点点不一样。So, you want a smartphone, but you don't want one that has the desktop mode, because if you're using a phone with the desktop mode, you're using a phone with the desktop mode. Fortunately, it seems like there are some solutions out there. After some search, you found this, Ubuntu Touch, which, as the name suggested, is a folk Ubuntu optimized for touch. It supports its native apps, of course, but it also supports traditional Linux desktop apps as well as Android apps. Sounds fantastic, isn't it? Well, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. As you know, Ubuntu Touch is a very niche operating system, and no one on the internet is recommending daily driving this. You know an operating system is terrible when the ultimate guide to privacy would instead recommend something based on Google's product. I mean, Google's product sucks. Like, Google's probably listening to me right now as I'm recording this video.
I am not listening to you.
我操，不是吧？
Maybe after all, Google isn't that bad, as the saying goes. Sticks and stones may break my bones, and Google shall show me relevant ads when I actually broke them. But still, why? I mean, Ubuntu Touch sounds perfect. Why didn't it go popular AF, like some random Linux distro that's not an actual Linux distro? Well, if you want to learn more, please stick around, because I'm going to tell you just about that. Kinda like I'm going to tell you the message from our sponsor. This video is brought to you by me. 怎样才能关注沾脸科技 B 站频道呢？我们打开 B 站，点击搜索按钮，在搜索框中呢，输入沾脸科技。看到那个熟悉的图标了吗？看到就好，因为我不是打你。如果您不嫌麻烦的话呢，还可以来和我比划比划。Having a phone being able to run a desktop-ish interface when plugged into a monitor is nothing new. I mean, you probably heard this before unless you live here and are using a pathetic iPhone. Seriously, every major mobile operating system these days except iOS has some kind of desktop mode. For example, in Windows Mobile there's a feature called Continuum, which allows users to plug their phones into an external monitor and have UWP apps work like Windows 10 desktop. I mean, Windows Mobile, it's a pretty mainstream operating system, isn't it? Suppose you're a geeky person who wants to have a niche system to tweak around, you may want to use Android. And Samsung, Huawei, Xiaomi, LG, or just stock Android has some kind of desktop mode support. Nonetheless, if I've ever tried any of these solutions, I think you would agree that they are kinda lame. It's not like desktop mode is a fundamentally stupid idea or anything like that, it's just UWP or Android does not have high-quality desktop apps. One of the best examples is the browsers. I mean, just see how many YouTubers are saying Chrome OS is better than the Samsung DeX. Thus, Ubuntu Touch looks very promising to me, because to my knowledge, Ubuntu supports both Firefox without a Fox and Chromium on ARM. So I thought this system was going to turn my phone into a Chromebook on my hand. Nevertheless, that's just my theory, and the theory is when you know everything but nothing works. The practice is when everything works but no one knows why. As for Ubuntu Touch, the theory and practice are combined. Nothing works and no one knows why. Anyway, I bought Xiaomi Mi A2 to try out Ubuntu Touch, because this is the only device on the top of the support list that has a reasonably modern hardware. Let's start with the installation process. To install the system, you need UBports installer. In the perfect world, this installer will do everything for you, including unlock the bootloader, format the drive, fetch the new recovery, etc. Unfortunately, we're not living in such a world. The UBports installer isn't that helpful, considering that I still need to manually unlock the bootloader and install a specific version of Android. I mean, it's not hard per se, but it lacks a step-by-step instruction, which can lead to some troubles. And I also believe a step-by-step instruction is much easier to make and much more helpful than a complex cross-platform installer that doesn't really work. So what was my problem? Aha, I'm glad you asked. So my device, Mi A2, despite being a Xiaomi device, does not run MIUI. Instead, it runs Android One, aka stock Android. Usually, you will use Mi Unlock tool to unlock your Xiaomi devices, which I tried but it didn't work because the unlock tool says my device does not tie to my Mi account, even though I had logged into some Xiaomi apps before. What is particularly frustrating is that the TWRP guide actually says this is how I'm supposed to unlock my phone. I hate automatically generated documents. So how do I supposed to unlock my phone? Well, according to this guy from XDA, I need to blah 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 and finally run this mysterious bad script. What are the commands? How complex are they? Why can't the author just include it in the tutorial and save my time from downloading a separate file? Let's find out, shall we? Okay, very cool. So I have two problems here. First and foremost, it's me unlock, not my unlock. Why anyone on this goddamn planet pronounce it or spell it like that? And second, UBport's installer comes with ADB and Android drivers, so UBports definitely can include this feature in their installer, or at least say something like, you know, to unlock the bootloader, just install the driver and then type this line of code. Anyway, these are just minor details. I'm fine with it. What is not fine, however, is the bug. I repeat the same installation process 3 times, and somehow I got a different result every single time. It wasn't until the last time that I finally got the thing to work. This inconsistency drives me crazy, and I think Albert Einstein would agree with me, as he says essentially he's doing the same thing and expecting a different result. I thought Ubuntu Touch was going to make my phone a desktop computer, but what I didn't expect is that it actually makes my phone a quantum computer. What a technological breakthrough. After the somewhat unpleasant installation experience, there you have it, Ubuntu Touch. The first time you use Ubuntu Touch, it will start a simple tutorial to help you learn the basic navigation. Why do you need to learn such a simple thing? Well, because Ubuntu Touch is pretty different. Gesture navigation is definitely what makes Ubuntu Touch unique. There's a bit of learning curve, of course, but once you get used to it, it can be more efficient in some ways, just like Linux. I mean, Android is technically Linux, but you know what I'm talking about. You can get your dock by swiping from the left, where you can have your favorite apps pinned and access the app drawer. You can have your control/message center by swiping from the top of the screen, similar to Android and iOS. What is different, however, is while you're pulling down, you can swipe left or right to pick the setting you want to change. So before you pull it all the way down, you already have the setting you want to change selected. This is so efficient while so intuitive. I just think this design is absolutely brilliant. For example, if I want to change the Wi-Fi my device is connected to, I can get to the Wi-Fi menu with one single drag. On Android, I need to yada yada yada, not efficient. But at least it's better than iOS. On iOS, there's only one proper way of doing this. Throw the iPhone to the trash can where it belongs to. Swipe from the right, you can get your multitask interface, which looks like Windows 7. Swipe from the bottom is the context menu. It's left for the program to decide. For instance, it's used to show all the tabs in the built-in browser. But did you notice anything missing? That's right, there is no universal way to go back. For most programs, you need to tap the top left corner, which is the opposite of ergonomic on big screens. Not to mention, some programs don't even include this button in some interfaces, so yeah, despite being innovative, this is definitely not the best way of interaction. But still, these days, Android and iOS are more or less the same, at least when it comes to navigation, so seeing something so different is really interesting and refreshing. What is not so interesting about being different is the app ecosystem. I mean, technically it supports Ubuntu desktop apps and Android apps. I'll get to that later. But for now, let's just talk about native apps. It's nothing. No, nothing. I mean, it has an app store, so there must be some apps, right? Well, yes, but actually no. 99.9% of the apps in the App Store are web apps. I mean, Windows Mobile, despite being a very niche operating system, still has a much better app ecosystem. Like, even though it doesn't have official YouTube app, it has great third-party clients like MyTube. But it's not the same for Ubuntu Touch. There is no native app. Like when I search Twitter, I can have more than 6 results, but all of them are web apps. Social media, news, tools, games, anything you can imagine are web apps. Don't get me wrong, web apps are not terrible. They're flexible, powerful, and easy to deploy. Even Apple these days make FaceTime web app. So yeah, web apps definitely have potential. With that said, you do need a good browser to take advantage of it, which unfortunately Ubuntu Touch doesn't have. The built-in browser lacks a lot of features that you might take for granted, like a password manager, extensions, online sync, etc. And the worst part is it doesn't feel responsive. It's really hard to describe, but it just feels laggy. And supporting PWA also means it's Chromium based. I'm not saying Chromium is bad, I'm just saying it's monopolistic. However, it doesn't matter, right? Because it supports Linux desktop apps and Android apps. Yeah, it supports those things. Except it doesn't. Let's start with the desktop part. OpenStore, the built-in store, doesn't really have any desktop app. And apt, the package manager, is half broken. So how do I supposed to install desktop apps? Well, I can use a container. It's not hard to create a container and it's not hard to install apps in it. It doesn't have a fancy interface, but it's quite straightforward. After installing the container, you can tap the top right plus sign to get your latest and greatest goodies. By latest and greatest, I mean those that support Ubuntu 16.04. If you don't know much about Linux, well, Debian distros including Ubuntu do not have great intergeneration software compatibility, which means you need to install a specific version of the package for a specific version of the system. And Ubuntu 16.04, as the name suggested, was released in April of 2016. Even though this version of Ubuntu is technically supported by the community today, it's old. Plus, Ubuntu Touch runs on ARM platform, which didn't get great desktop app support until relatively recently thanks to the release of one from Apple. Thankfully, even those limitations exist, we can still install many programs that we know and love, including Firefox, LibreOffice, Visual Studio Code, etc. But it does not mean we can actually use them. The compatibility for the container is awful. The best case is the program can run, but it does not support virtual keyboard. Some other programs like Firefox can open, but they cannot function correctly. Many other programs basically give up, give it up. I'm sorry. Maybe you have noticed that even for programs that do work, the phone screen is too small. So why did I use the phone screen when I can plug it into an external monitor? Well, because I can. I really shouldn't take the ability to connect to an external monitor for granted. After all, this is a Xiaomi device and yeah. Did you know when you turn the Mi logo upside down, it becomes the Chinese character for heart? I think this explains why Xiaomi is so capable of making products that give me the most precise heart attack, because they are such an anti-heart company. But there's still hope. According to the maintain list, this device may support wireless external displays. This was my last hope. I crossed my fingers and I knocked the hardest wood with my elbows. So what we learned today? That's right, what stops you from using your dock won't stop you from being like a duck. And also the wireless external monitor doesn't work. Okay, maybe it's time for us to give up Linux desktop, but what about Android apps? This one is even worse. To start with, even though this is technically a feature of Ubuntu Touch, it does not come pre-installed, which means you have to enable it manually. Second, did you remember that I said Ubuntu Touch doesn't have a back button? Guess what? Many Android apps need a back button. Last and also the least, the performance is a little bit less than ideal. And it crashes. Of course it crashes.
What?
Fine, maybe I can settle with limited native experience. So I think it's time to go back to the very beginning and talk about the stock experience of the system itself. Some people may say a lot of good things about the overall art design of this system, but for me, there are really just two types of designs in this world: material design and steaming hot garbage. Material design is the best! Change my mind! The font of this system is too thin and too stylized that it's hard to read, and I don't like the shape of the built-in app's icons. Especially when a lot of third-party programs are not following the same guideline. Some icons are not using vector images for some reason, making the whole system look less appealing. But again, art design doesn't matter. I mean, so many people these days are still using Windows 10. So, how about the apps? Well, they're fine, I guess. These are the most generic apps I could ever think of. They're like the assignments you will have for app development 101. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that they are easy to make or something like that. I'm just saying they don't feel polished. The calendar app is a calendar app that does not support online sync. The clock app is a clock app without online sync. The phone app is a dial app without online sync. The music app is a music player without online sync. The Morph browser, as I said, is a browser without online sync. The Notes app is a Notes app that can sync with an online service. Despite being basic, these apps do get their jobs done. That is, with two noticeable exceptions, which are the camera and the terminal. That already sounds like a big bummer, isn't it? Let's start with the camera app. Well, to be clear, the camera app does have some interesting features. For example, you can get your context menu by swiping from the bottom, in which you can adjust things like grids, flashlights, HDR, etc. Years later, Google adopted a similar gesture into their camera apps, which makes the quick adjustments easier. Apple. As you can see in the context menu, this camera app has a nice blur effect. By nice, I mean ugly and inefficient. I haven't experienced dropping frame like this in a built-in app for such a long period of time. What is even worse is that this blur effect doesn't look good. Just look at the edges. They are not blurred at all. And like the rest of the system, the camera app loves to stop working randomly. Oh! So you want to take an HDR photo? Great! Let's stop working! Thankfully, it's not all that random, because it constantly crashes when I record videos. I mean, this is such a basic thing.
Therapist, a bad Linux terminal isn't real. It can't hurt you. A bad Linux terminal.
I do want to clarify one thing. I don't like to use a terminal. If there's something that can be done by both a GUI program and a command line one, I will go for the GUI one. My unpopular opinion is the terminal isn't powerful by itself, it's because of the software. And the only reason why terminal programs are generally speaking more powerful is that developers can focus on the features and functions instead of the user interface. A terminal on a smartphone just doesn't make a whole lot of sense because the phone doesn't have a big screen or a physical keyboard. This is just not the right way of user interaction. Unfortunately, Ubuntu Touch, like many other Linux distros, relies on the terminal. As you saw, it needs a terminal to interact with things like Mbox and wireless displays. You know what can make it worse? How about a bad implementation? The terminal in Ubuntu Touch, like the rest of the system, is very focused on the gesture control. Swipe up and down to view the command history, swipe to left to move the text cursor, swipe to right to do the autofill as well as move the cursor. And guess what? When you have one gesture for two things, that's where things go wrong. So at the end of the day, Ubuntu Touch is not a good system at all, but Ubuntu Touch was a good one. It was in the year 2013. People at CES were attracted by a Samsung Galaxy Nexus, but it wasn't just any Samsung Galaxy Nexus. It was the one that's running Ubuntu Touch. This was a successful debut. Maybe this demo isn't impressive by today's standard, but remember, this was 2013. In 2013, iOS looked like this, and Android looked like this. The brand new system hyped up the media at that time. The design was outstanding, the user interaction philosophy was innovative, and the vision was absolutely beautiful. Why do I want to use my phone as my computer? The reason is simple. I won't need two-factor authentications. I won't need to sync with my PC. And it's much easier for me to justify the cost of a modern flagship phone. Not to mention, by buying less devices, I am saving the planet. But at the same time, the vision was too big. As it turns out, allowing your phone to run full desktop system was just a small part of the vision. Ubuntu Touch was far more complex than that. First, they want every Android device to be able to run Ubuntu Touch, which means they cannot rely on the traditional Linux drivers. Instead, this system must be compatible with Android Debugging Bridge and Hardware Abstract Layer. Second, in order to have a user-friendly interface for touchscreen, they developed an all-new desktop environment, or more like handtop environment. This desktop environment is based off of Qt 5 and has many interesting technical details, but unfortunately I will not talk about that because this video is already too long. Third, This will be a consumer product, which means they need to make sure stupid people cannot easily break their product. And that's why they built a completely different app store and a container to run all the traditional Linux apps. Last but equally time-consuming and frustrating is that they need to develop a new SDK to allow other developers to develop apps for their platform. Now that may sound like a lot, because it is. This is almost a new Linux distro. The vision of Ubuntu Touch was so beautiful that there is still one foundation willing to maintain the whole system after being discontinued for so many years, yet too ambitious that it can't be realized. Perfect is the enemy of good, and I can hardly believe that Ubuntu Touch can go anywhere further. But at the same time, the legacy of Ubuntu Touch is already all over the place. Gesture control becomes the new industry standard, desktop mode becomes more and more common, and containers are implemented in a lot of systems like Chrome OS for security. Maybe, just maybe, the whole vision isn't just a daydream. Maybe in the future, Apple will put their M1 chip or whatever chip into their iPhone, allowing iPhones to run macOS and making them Mac Mini. So, future me here, the script was written before WWDC 2021, and I just knew that iPad Pro, which has a Thunderbolt port, can connect to a Pro Display XDR, and by doing so, you can only mirror your iPad. Who wanted two screens to show the same content? Who asked for that? What the That's all for today's video. I hope you enjoy it. This is actually the first time I make an English video like this. So please share your thought in the comment section. Your feedback is very important. And there is definitely something that I can do to improve my language. If you do want to help out as a volunteer, please send me a DM. I will be really happy. That's pretty much it. Thanks for watching.